of that some people are born natural figures of note, and others have greatness thrust upon them. I don't know. I don't really know what it's like anymore. I remember as a kid growing up that there were people, friends all around me, and we all had a particular idol in the sports world or in the music world or something like that. And whenever you asked us what we were going to be like when we grew up, we were going to be just like that person. You know, I'm thinking we're going to be just like Johnny Unitas, or we're going to be just like Roger Staubach, or something along those lines. How many little boys are there out there today who are saying, I'm going to be Tom Brady when I grow up? And how many of them actually grow up to be like that? Not many, but it gives them something to hope for, gives them something to dream about. How many people do you think there are growing up and going to our schools? And this is the scary question I'm going to ask. How many do you think there are that growing up, going to our schools right now, that say, I want to grow up flipping burgers? And that's all I want to do. If I have to do something, I want to flip burgers. How many people, though, have been great but have had that thrust upon them? They happened to be in the right place at the right time. They rose to the occasion, even though it was completely out of character for them. Well, Nehemiah is something kind of like that. Nothing he did leading up to the events of Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, would have suggested that he was intended to be anything more than a cupbearer to the king. And things turned out pretty different for him. Last time, which was like 3 weeks ago now, I guess it was, because we had a little white elephant Christmas party in there. You ever had a Christmas party with a white elephant? You just don't do the conga with him. Anyways, and then we didn't have services last Sunday evening, so it's good to be back again. And last time we were dealing with the book of Ezra, and so this time we're dealing with the book of Nehemiah. And just briefly remember that I suggested that originally Ezra and Nehemiah were one book rather than two different books, and because in the Jewish Tanakh it still appears as one book. And just for convenience sake, more than anything else, whenever they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek in 250 BC, they separated Ezra into two books, Ezra and Nehemiah. And so last time we looked at the book we looked at the book we know as Ezra. This time we're looking at the book we know as Nehemiah. And you'll notice there that there are 6 different elements. We're not going to cover all 6 of those tonight. And we'll go through everything. We're not going to read, for example, chapter 12, verses 1 through 26, and the registry of the priests, or something like that. But we're gonna look at what Nehemiah did that made him, that thrust him into a moment and turned him into a person of some importance. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1 says, "These are the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel." And so we see that Nehemiah, when all this opens up, was living in Susa. Now, once Persia took Babylon and assimilated Babylon into their empire, and it was the combined empires. Remember, Babylon, their capital city of Babylon was Babylon. Capital city of Persia was Susa. And so when they combined the two of them, Persia had, in effect, two different capital cities. They had the northern capital, which was Babylon, and they had the southern capital, which was Susa. I don't know, I guess the king was a snowbird, and he fled to the south during the winter months in order to be able to stay warm or something like this. He also goes on to tell us that this was in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. We know that it's in the 20th year according to verse 1, but it doesn't really tell us what it's about until we hit the name King Artaxerxes. King Artaxerxes, the 20th year, that would make this about 445 BC. So if we do the math, this is about 90 years after Cyrus allowed the Israelites to return and begin to rebuild. What has transpired in 90 years in Alamogordo? What's gone on in the last 90 years? Yeah. I wasn't here 90 years ago. Maybe some of you were, but I was not here 90 years ago. You know, I was reading a history of Baptists in New Mexico, and Baptists back at the turn of the 1900s, which was more than 90 years ago, about 1910 or so, they decided that what they needed in New Mexico was a nice, good Baptist college. And so they formed the very first Baptist college that ever existed in the entire state of New Mexico before it ever became a state. And that Baptist college was located right here in Alamogordo. It lasted about 4 years, and all the instructors said, "I'm hungry, I got to go back to farming in order to be able to eat." There just wasn't enough money to support the venture. What's happened since then? That was 1911, I think it was, whenever they closed their doors. So that was 93 years ago. What's happened in the meantime?
It's built up on the mountainside.
It's built up on?
Traffic lights now.
Yeah, we got traffic lights now. I think when I was reading the history, I think they said there was only something like 22 cars in the entire state of New Mexico at the time. There was no traffic jam there.
1911 and 1910, there was 221 miles roads in the U.S.
Yeah, not much. Not much. Now we have traffic signals. What's happened with the people who returned over the past 90 years? Well, they have gone back. They have returned. They started the temple, then they stopped building the temple, and once Haggai and Zechariah lit a fire under them, they finished building the temple. And then after that, a little period elapses, and we go back to the empire, and we read about Queen Esther, and then we come back, and this is 445 BC. This is near the very end of the historical documents that we have regarding the Old Testament. And it says here that they told him that the walls were torn down. You know, it was the Jerusalem was broken, the gates were destroyed by fire. And in verse 4, it says, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and I mourned for
Jerusalem.
No, for days." Yeah, yes, he did weep and mourn for Jerusalem. Yeah, but he wept and he mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying. You know, I do a pretty good job of fasting between 9 a.m. and noon. By all accounts, he was fasting and mourning for days. And I prayed and I said, "O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants." And he goes on, he's basically asking them for help. Verse 11, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants. On and on. He's praying, God, intervene. God, do something. And the very last phrase of chapter 1, what does he say? He was cupbearer to the king. What is that?
The one that tastes the wine before the king does it, or checks his food to see if anything's poisoned.
So he had the cup in his hand, and he sipped some of it before he gave it to the king. And if it was poisoned, what would happen? He is going to die. So, like that. Here you go, king. Funk. What's the king going to do? I ain't touching that. It may have been a coronary, but he still said, I ain't going to touch that. The problem, the walls of Jerusalem are unrepaired. The city is defenseless. And Nehemiah took this personally, and he decided that somebody had to do something. Now, let's go back up to, he took this personally and developed a plan. He develops his plan in chapter 2, verse 1. It's the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Wine was before him. I took the wine and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing that you're not sick? Why is he concerned? Well, it could be a little bit of both. He does like him, but on the other hand, why are you suddenly looking like that? You're my cupbearer. But he does like him. There is no doubt about that. And so he tells him, verse 3, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said, what are you asking? So I prayed to the God of heaven. I love this. I love what Nehemiah had to say here. I threw it out there. I said, why shouldn't I? And the king says, what do you want? And I go, Lord, help me now. And then I plunge full steam forward. I said, if it pleases the king and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah that I may rebuild. So with the blessings, and I put that, Artaxerxes was behind this. He sends Nehemiah off to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, and in chapter 2, there we go. He's there for 3 days, verse 11. I went to Jerusalem. I was there for 3 days. I arose in the night. I had a few men with me. I told no one what God had put in my heart to do. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring, to the dung gate. I inspected the walls of Jerusalem. And then he talks about he went on and he went on and on and on. He reviews the condition of the walls at nighttime. Why did he do this at nighttime? First of all, he didn't want anybody to see what he's doing. Secondly, given the commerce that's coming in, it might have been a little bit easier for him to get around without a whole bunch of people in the way. But really, at the end of the day, he just didn't want anybody to see that. And then in verse 17, I said to them, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gate burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. The hand of my God has been upon me for good. And so he reveals who he is, why he's there, his plan to rebuild. We don't have walls around our cities anymore. Not in the United States at any rate. It has been this way for 90 years since they came back. Why would they be worried about it now?
Security for the town, with a wall.
It was security, but they hadn't had one for 90 years. Why are they worried about it? Why would they be worried about it now? Why had they not done anything if it was important to them?
They didn't have a leader.
Well, they had some leaders because they rebuilt the temple. Sheshbazzar was there for a while. Jeshua was there for a while. It was a needful thing for security in that particular world. We don't know why, other than they just kept putting things off. Someday. And they got comfortable, and someday never arose. That's the only thing that most people can come up with. Well, they proceed to go forward with all of this, and there was some opposition immediately. Sometimes opposition comes in the form of, we ain't never done it that way before, and sometimes opposition is different. He mentions two people who are unhappy about Nehemiah rebuilding the walls on the outside. Chapter 2, verse 19, it says, Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it. They jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They are opposed to the rebuilding of this wall. It's going to be counter to whatever their purposes are. And so they are going to make fun of them, and they're actually going to play is the king behind us, does the king know what you're doing kind of card. If you fast forward to chapter 4, verse 7, it mentions them again, but it mentions more than just Sanballat and Tobiah. Chapter 4, verse 7, who is opposed to all of this? Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites. There are several groups external to all of this that are wanting to shut this down before it gets going. There's only one reason that most people could think of why they did not want a wall around Jerusalem. And what would that be?
Those people didn't want it because they had the idea that Nehemiah wanted to be king. They were spreading that around, that he wanted to take over.
Well, they were definitely threatening to go to the king because of what Nehemiah was doing, but why did they take personal interest in not having it built?
Because it was easy access to get in and out of the city.
There you go. It was easy access. We can do whatever we want to do. They can't resist us no matter what the situation may be, no matter what the circumstances may be. But there's also some internal opposition to all of this. If you drop down to chapter 5, starting with verse 1, they're getting ready they're actually in the process of building. It says, there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers, for there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. There are also those who said, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money from the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, our children are as their children, yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved. It is not in our power to help, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. Several wealthy Israelites were enslaving fellow Israelites economically, and they could not find time to work, and they didn't want to work. They were painfully aware of their situation in life. They're painfully aware of their children's situation in life, and so it kept them from being able to work on the wall. And look at what Nehemiah says in chapter 5, verse 6. I was angry when I heard their outcry in these words. So I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. How is that a charge? Israelites weren't supposed to do that. They were being disobedient to the law. And so he told them, you're going to stop it now until we get the wall taken care of them. In verse 12 They said, we will restore and we will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. And I called the priests and made them swear to do as they promised. In other words, he held them to account for the way they were treating their fellow Israelites, the ones who were going to actually be able to do work on the wall. And they said, you're right, we were wrong. We're not going to ask them to repay us for what we've loaned them. And whenever he's talking about the priests, it's talking about they were part of the whole. They had some of the land outside. They had the grain coming in. They weren't doing their part in helping the people either. And then, building on top of that, verse 14, from the time that I was appointed to be the governor in the land of Judah, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. And so they didn't lord it. He didn't lord it over the people. So what did he do? He first of all told them, it's not right that you're doing this. You will stop. And they said, you're right. And they completely stopped. And then secondly, he refused to even eat the allotment, the taxable allotment that was coming from them, so they would have more. So there is no reason why they should not be able to finish building the wall. Well, in chapter 4, they're building the wall. They're working hard on the wall. Verse 15. Well, and actually, if you're reading in verses 1 through 14, it talks about the opposition. Those folks who were on the outside, who did not like what was going on, decided that they were going to harass the people building the wall. They would come in on horses, they would shoot arrows at them, they would, and all that sort of stuff. And so now they have this opposition to Sanballat and Tobiah, and what they're saying to them, they're having opposition to all that's going on within, and then Sanballat and Tobiah, realizing that they're continuing work on the wall, decide to harass them militarily. And so, starting with chapter 4, verse 16, from that point in time going forward, the people were being harassed. Half of my servants worked on construction, and half held spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall. So first of all, half worked, half stood guard. Some carried materials with one hand and a sword with the other hand. Those who carried burdens, verse 17, were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. Each of the builders had a sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded trumpet in order to alarm them of any kind of attack was beside me. And they were so spread out that they wanted to be able to support one another. And they continued to work on the wall in that particular way. And as you read through it, it actually tells you who built what portion of what wall. And as you read through it, it's very interesting. The priest so-and-so, he and his sons built the portion of the wall that was in front of their house. And this leader and his family built the portion of the wall that was in front of his house. Why is he having those people who live right there rebuild the wall in front of their house?
They would be security too.
Yeah, quality control. Yeah. You want a wall, it's going to be for security purposes. You get to build a wall in front of your house. Guess what? I know it's going to be a good wall because if it collapses, they're hitting you first. Quality control. At the end of it all, how long did it take them? 52 days. The wall was finished on the 25th day of the month Elul, chapter 6, verse 15, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid, and they fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Okay? They were right. It had been helped. They had been helped.
Kind of makes you think of
What is possible if everybody pitches in? Yeah. So they rebuilt walls, they rebuilt gates, they rebuilt towers, they fended off enemies, half worked, half carried. What were they doing all day, every day? They were working from can to cant, from dawn to dusk. And they were building in such a way that it was their own livelihood that was at stake, their own household that was at stake, and it was spread out so that people all over. Now, if there was a gap where, like, say, the temple area was or something, they had other people working on it, not people who lived right there, because there wouldn't be anybody living right there. And once they had all of that finished, what did they celebrate? That Feast of Booths. It was the 7th month of the year, and they finished rebuilding the walls. In chapter 8, on the second day, the heads of verse 13, on the second day, the heads of fathers' houses of all the people with the priests and the Levites came together to Ezra in order to study the words of the law. They found it written that they should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, that they should proclaim it and publish it. And so guess what? They did. And they celebrated the Feast of Booths. The people went out, they bought items with which to make booths. They made booths for themselves, each on his own roof, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, the water gate, the gate of Ephraim. All the assembly of those who had returned from captivity made booths, and they lived in those booths. And from the first day to the last, Ezra read from the book of the law of God. They kept the feast for 7th day, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the law. Well, he's got the wall rebuilt. The people are secure. Ezra is doing his job. They are continuing their worship and their observance of the Feast of Booths. And we see in here a few other things that happened. That's all part of the covenant renewal. They settle the land. We see the priests. They actually dedicate the wall. But in the middle of all of this, Nehemiah leaves and he goes back to Susa. And in chapter 13, he returns from Susa to Jerusalem after a 12-year term in Jerusalem. He returns to Susa, and later he comes back from Susa to become governor yet once again. And there are some very unsettling things. In that short, brief period of time that he was gone, after he had left Jerusalem, he had gone back to Susa, and then he returns. He finds out that an Ammonite was living in the temple. Ammonites weren't even allowed to enter into the worship under the law of Moses. Chapter 13, verse 4, Eliashib the priest, who is appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who is related to Tobiah the Ammonite, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber, a place for him to live, where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given to the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. It was the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. He had returned. So he's living there, and a priest put him up. Come on in. Verse 8. He came back. He discovered all that had happened. In verse 8, I was angry, and I threw out all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber, and I gave orders, and they cleansed the chamber. And I brought back into there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. In that short period of time, the priests had allowed an Ammonite to actually live in the temple. The tithes were not coming in chapter 13, verse 10. And so he confronted the officials and asked them why it had been forgotten. And so he appoints treasurers and whatnot. And so they set things in motion so the tithe will come back in. The Sabbath was not being honored. They were actually buying and selling and trading in the market on the Sabbath. And he said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And so he actually shut the gates of Jerusalem at the beginning of the Sabbath, and he did not open them up. How many times do you think somebody showed up to buy, sell, or trade when the gates were shut before they got the idea that it wasn't going to be open anymore? Once. They showed up once. It wasn't going to happen. They went away. He's restoring what? He rebuilt the wall. He was the governor. Yet here he's doing things that the priest should have been doing. Not letting him live in the temple, not the tithes not coming in, the Sabbath not being honored. It's things that the priests should have been doing, and now Nehemiah steps up to do all of that. There's an old problem with a new look. We saw this in Ezra, now we see it again in Nehemiah. Verse 23, I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod. They could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. Ezra confronted them because of their intermarrying back in Ezra, and now Nehemiah confronts them once again because of their intermarriage. He confronts an old enemy. As you look at verse 28, he was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Hororite, and I chased him away. Verse 30, Nehemiah chapter 13. Thus I cleansed the people from everything foreign. I established the duties of the priests and the Levites, each in his work. I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. And his prayer that ends the book of Nehemiah, remember me, oh my God, for good. You would think that he wouldn't be worried about that and he'd have to pray something like, remember me, oh my God, for good. But he prayed that nonetheless at the very end of it all. After all that he had done, remember me, oh my God, for good. What kind of person was Nehemiah?
Seemed like a very
A very caring, a great leader. How do you go from being cupbearer to being governor?
Ask the king.
Ask the king. God was behind it all.
And he was obedient to God. And it's like he lived for the Lord. He's a good man.
Evidently, the king's wife liked him too. That might have had a lot to do.
Well, that could be. In Ezra, we see the model priest, the model Jew, and perhaps the model Christian study God's word, do God's word, teach God's word in that order. You know, the law was important as a means to an end, provided them to renew that covenant that they had made. In Nehemiah, we see the model church member. He was not a religious leader, but he took it upon himself to get involved in taking care of God's people. The Old Testament, the law became authoritative in their life. There's a renewed effort towards purity. They become people of prayer. Nehemiah had greatness thrust upon him. But how did it start? Fasting and prayer. For how long? Days. What does it take to be touched by what's going on in the world to weep and mourn for days, to fast and pray for days? Why are not people touched that way anymore? Was it just because God had Nehemiah set aside and that was Nehemiah's coming of age process?
What we're supposed to be once we become Christians. We're supposed to be caring about other people doing what we said about.
Yeah, and he wept, he mourned over their plight. What did Jesus do when he looked upon Jerusalem, according to the Gospels? He wept.
I think we still see, because I know God still calls people, but I think we still see examples like Nehemiah, when people began ministries.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to think of, I'm thinking maybe Samaritan's Purse started off from a broken heart.